Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Faulkner. I am the co-host of the Radical Respect podcast with Kim Scott, who will join us in just a moment. But I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself for those who don't know who I am. So currently, I work in developer relations. I've been in tech for 25 years, but for the last 15, I've been doing community management. And every job I've had, sometimes I've run into a person here and there who really didn't connect with me. I didn't connect with them. We would talk past each other. One example is I was a social media manager for a tech company. And I was in charge of their whole social strategy. And occasionally, the other marketers on my team would just post to social. They wouldn't even tell me. I would go in, open up the application, and just see these posts. And I'm a professional, so I had a strategy, I had a tone of voice, I had like scheduled posts and all that. And so I would say to them, could you please not just post to social, just talk to me first. And I thought I was being nice. I mean, I said the word please. But they took me as someone who was controlling or someone who just wanted to make sure that this was only my domain. And I saw myself as being kind. I saw myself as being generous and very professional, but they didn't see me that way. I felt ostracized and othered and not part of the in crowd. Anyone else feel that way at work sometimes? Yeah? And for that reason, I felt like sometimes I had problems with belonging. In 2020, when we all had to belong with each other because of the pandemic, I was forced to confront something that I was kind of hiding from the rest of the world. You see, I'm neurodivergent. I have ADHD and dyslexia. And that means that I see the world differently. I think differently. I kind of like process things differently than other people. And it wasn't until I read an early version of Kim's book, Radical Respect, that things really started to make sense, where I wasn't feeling like I'm a bad person that's working within a system, but what was actually happening is I'm a good person working in a bad system. And her book gave me hope. Her book gave me purpose. And once this sense of hope came in, I couldn't just hold it in. I had to reach out. And so I wrote Kim an email about what her book meant to me. And she responded back. But at that time, the Radical Respect podcast had started from this early version of the book, and she had a great co-host named Ernest Adams. But Ernest, being a DEI professional who's really, really good, just got a brand new job heading up DEI for Ford Motor Company. And with this empty space in the podcast, Kim asked me if I wanted to take it. I mean, of course I said yes. And that's how we started the podcast together. And with that, I would like to take the time to bring out the author of Radical Respect, the author of Radical Candor, my podcast co-host and my good friend, Kim Scott.
Thank you so much, Wesley. You know, when you are a writer, as I am, you sit alone for years often. Alone, and was in my garage, and writing, and you never know if something is gonna resonate for other people. And so when you wrote me after you read the early version of Radical Respect, it meant so much to me. And part of the reason why it meant so much was that one of the things I want to do with this book is build community.
Yeah.
We need to be in solidarity with each other this year more than maybe other years. And I'll just leave it to you to guess what I'm talking about. And I think that you know how to build, like I wouldn't be here at South by Southwest without you. No. You know how to build community. And so I'm so excited to share these ideas with you and with all of you so that we can build the kind of respectful workplaces we all want.
Yes, yes. And one thing about the book that really shone the importance of radical respect was just the title. Can you explain a little bit about like what radical respect actually means?
Yes, all radical respect is, you know me, I love a good 2x2. Maybe we can cue the 2x2. Radical respect means that we are optimizing for collaboration, not coercion. Mm-hmm. And we all know this is kind of the right thing to do. Like, how many of you out there want to work in a coercive work environment?
Right.
No, only one, only one. A very brave soul. So nobody really wants to be coerced. And I've worked with a ton of different kinds of leaders in the course of my career. And I've never met one, I mean, I'm sure they're out there, but I've never met anyone who said, I want to create this coercive work environment.
Right.
Because we know, both as individuals and as leaders, that we do our best work, we're most creative, we're most innovative when we are optimizing for collaboration. Now, the second part of radical respect is honoring everyone's individuality.
Right.
Which doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
Yes.
But we expect when we go to work that our own individuality will be honored. And I think most of us think of ourselves as people who honor others, the individuality of others. And yet, so often in the workplace, people begin to demand conformity without even realizing what they're doing. Now, I got another question for you all. How many of you really want to work in a 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of, right? You don't. Nope, nobody.
Right.
And it turns out most leaders don't intend to create that kind of workplace. They don't intend to demand conformity. And yet, all too often, they do anyway. And so that's what we're talking about. Radical respect, collaboration, and honoring individuality. Why doesn't this always happen? Seems kind of like table stakes,
yes.
really.
And when you wrote the book and I read it, the thing that kind of like helped put this framing about really understanding the type of challenges I was dealing with was this thing called the taxonomy.
Not the taxonomy.
Not the taxonomy.
The taxonomy.
It's that time of year, but the taxonomy. Can we break that down? Like, what is that? What is the taxonomy?
Yeah, so I think that when you talk about disrespect at work, or really in any other part of our lives, it feels like such a monolithic, horrible thing. And one of the things that I learned in tech is that in order to solve a problem, you want to break it down into its component parts. You want to parse the problem. And so on the bottom of every other page of the book is this taxonomy. And the taxonomy includes bias, prejudice, and bullying. And then it also includes what happens when you layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying. And you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violence. Now, we're going to just talk about the first part, bias, prejudice, bullying, today. That seems like enough for an hour.
Yes. And so we're going to save a lot of time just to make sure that we get to all of your questions. So if you have the South by Southwest Go app on your phone, if you launch this session, you should see something for Slido. So Slido is going to allow you to ask questions. So as soon as you think of something, put it in, and we'll make sure that there's plenty of time that we can try to answer and get to as many questions as we can at the end. So start thinking about that now. So let's take this taxonomy and break it down to each individual parts. So let's start with the first one. What was the first one? Is it bias?
Yeah. So how many of you are a little confused? What's bias, what's prejudice, what's bullying? Aren't they the same thing? When I started writing the book,
I thought they were the same.
Yeah, I was confused. Because I think one of the reasons why we don't disrupt these attitudes and behaviors is that we conflate them as though they're the same thing. So it's really useful to know how to respond to each. So I'm going to offer you some very simple there's a lot more to say about each of these words, but it's useful sometimes to have overly simple definitions. So bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. Bias is usually unconscious. We don't really intend the implications of what we've just said or done.
Yeah, and we all have biases.
Yes, right? We all have biases. Prejudice, on the other hand, is a very consciously held belief, usually including some kind of stereotype, unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And you've got to respond to bias and prejudice very differently. It's harder to deal with prejudice than bias. At least it is for me, so I'm curious what other people think. And then last but not least, there's bullying. No belief, conscious or unconscious, it's just being mean is a useful way to think about it. And more to be said. So bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it, and bullying is just being mean.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I think I have it straight. I'm sure I do. But if you had to think about bias, what would be, let's say, an example of bias?
Yeah. So why don't we back up? Let me tell you why I wrote the book. Like,
yes.
Why did I start thinking about this over and over and over again? Because I had a very intense experience.
Okay.
I had written Radical Candor, which is a book largely about feedback. And if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And this happened, the best feedback I got on Radical Candor happened when I was giving a talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the person who had invited me to give that talk had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She is a person who I like and respect enormously, and she's one of too few black women CEOs in tech, or frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor at my company. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture that I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slammed with the angry black woman stereotype. And as soon as she said that to me, I realized, first of all, it was true, but I had 4 sort of deeper realizations at the same time. Oh. The first thing I realized was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander. Instead, I had been sort of a silent bystander. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting that we were in together, even though she had what to be ticked off about at work, as we all do. And so I hadn't lived up to my own expectations of myself as a colleague. Right. So that was number one. The second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to my colleague as a black woman in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I had pretended that a whole host of things had not been happening in the course of my life that had, in fact, been happening. So I had failed sort of as a person who was harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors to respond to them. The third thing, and I think I did that because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. We have such a problematic attitude about that in our society. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim did I ever want to think of myself as the culprit. And so I'd been most deeply in denial about the times in the course of my career when I had harmed other people with disrespectful attitudes or behaviors. And last but not least, as a leader, like Radical Candor was very much a book written for leaders, and I sort of imagined I was creating these bullshit-free zones where everybody could do the best work of their life and enjoy working together. And I realized suddenly that by pretending that these things were not happening, that were in fact happening, I had failed as a leader as well. So it was a big drink of water for realizing all 4 things.
All right, let's just do a quick recap. What are the 4, really quickly?
So sometimes we're the ups, and we all play all of these roles at different moments, and sometimes multiple roles at the same time. Sometimes we are the upstander, hopefully, and not the silent bystander.
And everyone could be an upstander.
Yes. And your job as an upstander is really to intervene in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes we are the person who's harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. Sometimes we are, all of us, the person who caused harm with disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, even if we don't intend to be. And sometimes we're the leader. And when you're the leader, it's your job to really prevent disrespectful attitudes and behaviors from hurting your team's ability to advance, to work in a radically respectful way.
And when we are thinking about this framework of the four things that came to you, one of the things that you mentioned before was bias.
Yeah.
And bias is something that we do and we're susceptible of. Are you someone who does bias as well?
Of course. I mean, every single person, this is the role of the person harmed. We all have biases.
Right.
What I want to do is talk about maybe a story. Can I tell you a story?
About
bias?
Yes.
About an upstander standing up to
Yeah.
bias. So I think that for me, one of the best stories about bias, maybe you have a better story. I'll tell my story first and then you tell your story.
Okay. Let me think. So I remember when I was a developer advocate for this tech company. I just started 3 weeks in, and before I got the job, I had a really good conversation with the hiring manager. Her name was Jessica. And we talked about my aspirations. We talked about things that I was interested in doing and where I want my career to go. And 3 weeks into this job, a new VP was hired. They started on a Monday, and by Wednesday, I was taken off the team. I was put in.
By Wednesday?
By Wednesday.
So he didn't know, or she, this person, there was a little bias there. I was assuming it was a he. Was it a he?
It was a she.
She.
Yeah.
Okay. So she didn't know anything about your work. She just took you off the.
Yeah.
Okay.
She went straight away and did that. And after this meeting, I said, okay, I need to talk to my manager and just say goodbye and realize that things have changed. And that's, we all deal with change. So I called up my manager and I said, it was really great working with you. I'm sorry that we won't continue this journey together. And she said, what in the who now?
Has that ever happened? Like this new VP came in
Yes.
and took you off your manager's team without even talking
Without
to you?
even talking to my manager
Unbelievable.
first. And she said, is this something you wanted? Did you want to get off the team? And I said, no. She said, things change? You have a different alignment and you feel like this is a good move for you? And I said, no. And she's like, do you want me to fix this? And I said, yes. And so she contacted the VP, had a conversation, and by that Friday, I was back on the team as a developer advocate. And she also put in an HR complaint against the VP at that time. And so she really was a great upstander to really help me through that process.
I love that. So that was radical respect.
That was radical respect, yes, absolutely. And it opened up a whole world of collaboration. I knew she had my back. I absolutely had her back. We were able to collaborate and really push each other, and work actually went to another level after that. It was really great.
So that's an example of the system working.
Yes.
The manager built a system, it worked, you were able to do your best work, you enjoyed working together. So it can work out. I think one of the things I want to do is instill some optimism.
Yeah.
But also don't want to be in denial about why it doesn't work. So what could go wrong? Why might it not work?
I think it didn't work because we're dealing with this thing that was in your book that sounds like the taxonomy that we talked about.
Yes.
And so in different ways, I ran into this framework of all the places or all the things that can interrupt work.
Yeah, so maybe the VP that came in, maybe it was biased, maybe it was prejudiced, maybe it was a bully.
Maybe it was all three.
Yeah, these are not MECE, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. But these are the behaviors. So let's sort of think about, let's parse the problem and what to do, how to figure out whether it's bias, prejudice, or bullying, and what to do when you notice it, so that you can create the kind of radically respectful workplace that your boss was able to create. So let's cue the next slide about bias, prejudice, and bullying. I think when it is bias, you want to reply with an I statement. When it is prejudice, with an it statement. When it is bullying, with a you statement. And we'll go through stories of all three. Mm-hmm. But
they'll kind of blend together.
Yeah.
So let's talk through them. What is the definition of these things?
Yeah. So again, bias is not meaning it.
Right.
And the best response to bias is an I statement. So I want to share, maybe we'll cue the next slide, and I want to share a story from my career about a friend of mine who was dealing with bias and who had an upstander on her team who was helping her deal with bias. Not because she couldn't stand up for herself, but because it's useful for an upstander to do it. So in this case, my friend had started a venture capital firm, and she was going into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. Mm-hmm. And when she went into the meeting, she sat down in the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. The next person, her colleague sat to her left, and her next colleague sat to his left. When the other side came into the room, the first person sat across from the guy to my friend's left. The next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving my friend dangling by herself. That is anybody notice bias showing up that way? Just who sits next to whom? Now I'm making all of you feel awkward. But that is often how it shows up. Now, my friend was undeterred. She began talking about the deal that they were considering. And as she was talking, when the other side had questions, they directed those questions at each of her colleagues, who were men, not at her. It was though she wasn't in the room. Anybody ever notice that happen? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so it happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and finally, one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think Tina and I should just switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. Because as soon as he did that, the other side realized what they were doing and they stopped doing it. And so that's an example of an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. I think we should switch seats. And why did he do that? He did it for three important reasons. The first reason is that he liked Tina and he didn't like seeing her get ignored. It was upsetting to him. And so there's always kind of an emotional element to this. And so that was awesome. The second reason why he did it is that he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if he couldn't get the other side listening to Tina, they wouldn't win the deal. And then the third reason that he did it is that it was more efficient. There was an efficiency argument. It was much easier for the other side to hear this from him than it would have been to hear it from her. They would have been doubly defensive from her. And not that she couldn't speak up for herself, but it was useful for him to do it rather than her. So that's an example of sort of an upstander standing up to bias. And no big deal, totally changed they won the deal, by the way.
That was an awesome move.
Yeah.
The bold move to just stand up and move.
Yeah.
Can I give an example of where I was biased?
Yes, see, we are all biased.
Yes.
So thank you for being willing to do that.
So my now wife, but then girlfriend and I were just starting to date. And we were earlier in our relationship, and some people have words that have significant meanings to them. And for me, I thought I was being nice. So after one of our dates, I reached out to her and I said, "I think you're an extremely smart and wonderful lady, and it's an honor to be able to be in a relationship with you." And she said, "I don't like the word lady." And to me, it just felt like a compliment.
You didn't even know.
I was confused, and I said, and then she took the time to explain it to me that the word lady for her was weighted. It came from being ladylike, being demure, or being someone who needs to be protected. And she's super progressive. I thought I was progressive, and I thought that was a fine compliment, but she took the time to tell me that she doesn't feel that word allows her the freedom to be herself. It was putting her in a box, and she didn't want the judgment of when she doesn't prescribe to that name or that word, lady. And so it was a real eye-opener to me about what words mean to different people.
I love that story, and I love it for a couple of different reasons. One of the reasons why I love that story, the most important, is the net result of disrupting the bias is a happy marriage and 2 beautiful children.
Yes, yes. We have 3 children. One's really old.
He's lying.
No.
2 children,
Yeah, 2.
both of them beautiful. The other reason that I love that story is that it shows the nuance in bias. Sometimes we get people writing into our podcast, and they're like, can you just give me a list of words not to use?
Yeah.
And the answer is no, because communication gets measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And it takes a certain amount of courage for both the listener and the speaker to say when something is not landing properly. And so kudos to your wife for being willing to say, I don't like it when you call me lady.
Yeah.
And kudos to you for being willing to listen. And this is not universal. Plenty of people love being called, a lady, and that's okay too. But
yes.
The other thing I love about your reaction is what you didn't say is, well, other women don't mind when I call them lady, and that was important because you were not having a relationship with other women. You were having a relationship
yes.
with that woman who became your wife. So.
Yes.
There's some nuance to this, unfortunately. I know we don't love nuance in this world, but we got to be willing to understand how things are landing for
Yeah, I was
folks.
extra motivated to be patient and making sure that I had a conversation because I was starting a new relationship. So that's a great example of being a bias and how to address it. But what if it's not bias? What if it's actually prejudice?
Yeah, which it is some of the time. I think sometimes one of the reasons we're in denial about bias is that we're even deeper in denial about prejudice. And so if it is prejudice, if the person actually believes that thing, an I statement is not going to work, because an I statement is like holding a mirror up for someone. And if it's prejudice that you're dealing with, they're going to grin in that mirror. They're going to like what they see, And so you need an it statement. One of my favorite examples of this comes from another story another friend of mine told me. My friend was in a hiring meeting, and everyone on the hiring committee who had interviewed all of the 10 candidates agreed that the person who was best qualified for the job was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interview process.
Right on.
Yes. And when the hiring manager heard this, the hiring manager said, well, I'm not going to extend an offer to that candidate. Boo. Mm-hmm. My friend then asked why. Why in the world would you not do this? And the hiring manager said, I'm not going to put that hair in front of the business.
Oh, no.
Mind-boggling. This was not long ago at a big company. So what is an it statement? What my friend could say, it is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state thanks to the Crown Act, and hopefully will be in all states thanks to the Crown Act. The second thing my friend could have said is, it is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. And if my friend had been in a situation where she didn't have the law and the HR policy on her side, she could have just appealed to common sense. It is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. And so an it statement kind of draws that line in the sand between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, and sometimes you don't want to engage with those beliefs, but they can't impose those beliefs on others. And that's what the it statement can do for you. Easier said than done.
Yes.
But incredibly important.
And you all deal with prejudice in your work environment?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's there.
And so we're at the last one, which is bullying, which is
Yes.
being mean. Anyone work with mean people?
Anybody experience bullying at work? Come on, you all. There you go.
And I remember one time in a job that I had, I was a product development engineer for a tech company. And this was the dawn of social media, like for reals. Like Twitter had just come out the day, like the year before. I got really into it. And I also loved my job. I love when I really I'm a technology nerd. And so when Twitter came out, I started tweeting about work, talking about the products that are going to be released, the announcements, and just sharing my love of technology, and especially my job. My day-to-day job was pretty interesting. And so I got fairly known as the person that worked for this company. And then I started to get incoming from press, from analyst firms, all asking, so what is your company doing and how are you using social media? So I had to keep sending them over to our PR team and our comms team for them, because I was like, oh,
you're an engineer,
I'm just
right?
an engineer,
Yeah.
just working. And eventually got the attention of our SVP, so Senior Vice President.
And this is like your boss's boss's.
This is my boss's boss's. This is 4 levels up. And he wanted to understand social media himself, because he saw it as a future. And we made an arrangement, and I had a weekly tutoring session with him. I would show up to his office, and then we would go over what is an @reply, what is a hashtag, how do you see about how many people you're following, what is back then, what does an egg icon mean when someone sends you a message, all of this stuff. And by this time, they formed a social media council for the company to figure out what is going to be the rules, and I was one of the founding members of this council. And things were working out great, and South by rolls around.
Early South
by. This is 2009, maybe. And we went to South by. I had a lot of connections in the social media space at that time, and introduced this SVP to a lot of my friends who were movers and shakers in the tech industry back then. And it went amazingly well. And the whole council came back, and the first thing my SVP did when we got back was to kick me off the council.
Not a good reward.
Yes.
For your work.
Stopped responding to all my emails, ignored my voicemails, just totally iced me out. And I was like clueless about what I did to deserve this.
I bet you weren't clueless. I bet you had some theories.
I had some theories, but it came clear a few weeks later when an email went out to the whole company about an all-hands meeting to introduce the company's guru for social media.
This SVP.
Yeah, it was not me. It was, and so I wanted to hear what he had to say. So our campus is situated where the cafeteria was right next to the auditorium. And so what I did was I went to the cafeteria, got my lunch, and then went straight to the auditorium, sat in the front row, and just started eating my lunch. Interesting to hear what this guy has to say. And they were still doing tech checks, making sure the mics worked and the projectors and all that. And when that was done, the SVP, came down from the stage, walked down, walked across, went straight over to me.
Like he's in your face.
And leans over, goes right in my face and says, "Don't ask any career-ending questions."
Ooh.
And I thought he was joking.
Bullying, right?
Yeah, I thought he was joking. And I said, "Whose career?" And by his reaction, I could tell that he was being super serious. And so that was a time where I knew that, I was being bullied at that time.
Yeah.
It dawned on me what was going on.
Anybody ever experienced that kind of bullying? Like, the nice thing about these stories is that they bring up experiences for other people and help us build solidarity. But I want to confess that there have been times in my career when I was the bully. And not because I intend to bully people. I really do not. I work very hard to be kind. But I think it's important to realize that sometimes we don't understand the impact we're having on others, especially when we tend to think of ourselves as, as the recipient of bullying rather than the culprit.
Yeah.
So for most of my career in tech, I was the only woman in the room, or one of very few women in the room. And then suddenly there came a moment when I was in the majority, when there was only one man in the room. This is when I was doing a podcast long before I met you with Russ.
You did a podcast before me?
You, I know.
Okay, yeah.
With Russ Laraway. This is in like 2017, 2016, I think. And we had fun together. Russ and I were co-founders, and we were doing a podcast. And I, as Wesley will tell you, I tend sometimes not to be super prepared. I just I like to wing it. And so I sat down in the hot seat, and it was a live podcast. And we started talking. And I was one of the people who had really helped me in my career as a coach was Amy Cuddy, who did the Wonder Woman pose. There's a great talk on that, a few great talks on that. And so I brought this up, but I hadn't delved into the most recent research before the podcast. And unbeknownst to me, recently Amy Cuddy had published something that explained that one of the claims that when you do the power pose, it actually increases your testosterone levels. She said that's not actually physically true. There were some early indications it was, but it wasn't. But I didn't know this. And so I said, one of the amazing things about the Wonder Woman pose is it increases your testosterone levels. And Russ said, actually, no, it doesn't. He corrected me. And instead of accepting the feedback, I dished out at Russ. Russ is a Marine, very tall, and I was like, oh, Russ, you were born doing a power pose.
His poor mom.
And all the women in the room burst out laughing, and Russ was silent. And so I was using Russ's gender to shut him up. And that had been done to me plenty of times, but turnaround is not fair play. We want to do better in this case. And so one of the things I want to warn people is that sometimes you're in a position of power that may be new to you. And when you're in a position of power, you're much more likely to bully others without even really seeing yourself as a bully.
So how did it come to your attention that you needed to actually address this thing?
Yes, so luckily, one of our listeners was an upstander, and he created a consequence for me. He sent me an email, and he said, you were a total jerk to Russ on that podcast, and you were not walking the talk here. And at first, I wasn't sure that I agreed with this feedback. And so I went to Russ. I didn't think Russ cared. And I went to Russ, and I said, Russ, what do you think about this feedback? I was not a bully. And Russ said, actually, that was a pretty significant slap down, and it shut me up. And I was like, oh, gosh. And so now in our next podcast, we kind of explained, and Russ forgave me, like it was okay. But I think it's really important that there are consequences for bullying. Because if there are not consequences for bullying, then the person either thinks they were intentionally doing it, like the person you were talking about, and they'll do more of it, or people who don't intend to be bullies will wind up continuing to bully people. So consequences are important.
So upstanders are really good, and that was a great example of an upstander stepping in, but leaders need to create the consequences for this type of behavior. So dealing with the bully is extremely one of the hardest ones to do.
Yeah.
So what are some of the consequences that leaders must put in place in order for bullies to know that that's not okay?
Yeah, so there's conversational consequences, there's compensation consequences, and there's career consequences. I think for conversational consequences, this is where the you statement applies, or a you question. What's going on for you here? Or you can't talk to your colleagues like that. You wanna nip it in the bud. And I learned about the difference between an I statement and a you statement responding to bullying from my daughter, actually, when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied, and I was encouraging her to use an I statement and to say, I feel sad when you blah, blah, blah. And she was like, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? And I'm like, that is a really good point. And so if an I statement invites someone in, a you statement pushes them away. You can't talk like that, or what's going on for you here? Why are you being this way? So that's number one. And when you're a leader, you want to make sure that you don't give people a platform to continue to bully others. So
it is your responsibility.
Yes, it is your responsibility. Now, what about compensation consequences? I think it's so important not to give people who bully their colleagues, who leave a trail of harm in their wake, in order to get results, good ratings. I worked at one tech company that did a very, I thought, a very smart system for assessing people's performance. They got rated on their results and on their innovation and on their teamwork. And if you got a bad rating on teamwork, you got a bad rating overall, no matter, it was not an average. No matter how good your teamwork was, there was a sort of no brilliant jerks rule at this company.
So you're totally capped on that. That's pretty awesome to make sure that.
Yeah, to make sure that you're not giving people bonuses or high ratings. Because if you reward bullying, you're going to get more of it.
Okay.
Surprise, surprise.
So if you hit them in the wallet, that's
yes, yeah. Compensation consequences. It has to feel real. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that there are career consequences for bullying. There comes a moment on the history of too many teams when the assholes begin to win. And that is the moment when the team culture begins to lose. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. You don't want to promote people who bully others. And I think one of the things that's really upsetting to me right now is that I think too often people think that bullying is like a leadership attribute, and it is not. It is absolutely not. Now, if you notice that someone is bullying others, hopefully not only do you not promote them, you give them some feedback. And if they can't change their behavior, you've got to fire them. That's the ultimate career consequences. It's better to have a hole than an asshole, because bad behavior hurts the behavior of the whole team.
Yeah, and it's really sucks to work with people. I'm sure. I mean, raise your hands if you work with some of these people that we talked about, and the ones who aren't raising their hand, their managers are probably sitting right next to them. It sucks to be in that environment. But if you are a leader, you're in charge of creating this environment. How do you set up an infrastructure so that bias doesn't ever really can derail the whole group?
Yeah. You want to, to the maximum extent possible, prevent bias. But of course, preventing bias is very difficult since it's sort of so omnipresent. So I came up with this bias disruptor program, and it's a very simple 3-step system that you can put in place with your team. And if you do this as a leader, and you don't have to be the boss of the team to lead your team through this process. You can propose it. But if you're able to do this, it'll make it much more likely. Like if we go back to the story I told about, I think Tina and I should switch seats. That doesn't happen that often. I actually had to talk to a lot of people to get to that story. And so how do you make it more likely that upstanders will stand up to bias and that people harmed will feel comfortable, or if not comfortable, they'll feel able to disrupt bias when it happens? So there's 3 things about bias disruptors. The first is you want to have a shared vocabulary.
Right.
So Wesley and I like this purple flag. This is our shared vocabulary. So if I say something biased, Wesley will wave the purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not a red flag or a yellow flag. He's helping to educate me.
Yeah.
And I'll do the same for him. And sometimes I'll wave the purple flag on myself. Sometimes I'll say something, then I'll realize. Now, you don't want to impose vocabulary on your team. So sit down, talk to your team. There's no magic words. There's no words that are going to eliminate the defensiveness that people are going to feel when you disrupt their bias. But so the right words are the words people are most likely to use. There was one team I worked with, and they just said, I don't think that you meant that the way it sounded. They used an I statement. Another team had kind of a cat theme going on, and they would meow at each other. Whatever works for you. You can also, this purple flag costs 12 cents. You can get that too. So you want a shared vocabulary. Now the next thing you want to do is you want to help people move. You can't control how people feel. You want to help them move through their predictable shame that they're going to feel.
Yes, I know I feel shame when someone points out something I did wrong.
Yeah.
And it just makes me freeze and then kind of like,
What was your first feeling when your now wife, then girlfriend, pointed out?
Oh, I was just like, what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
And then it just made me like, really confused, and I just didn't know what to say.
Yeah. So it's useful to help people know what to say when they don't know what to say. So sit down with your team and say, if someone points out bias, we're going to start by saying, thank you for pointing it out. And then we're going to say one of two things. Either I get it, I'm working on it, point it out if I do it again. Because sometimes these habits of speech are deeply ingrained, and it may take some persistence to change them. Now, the second thing that we might have to say when our bias is being pointed out, and this is even harder, is thank you for pointing it out. I don't know what I did wrong. Can you tell me after the meeting?
Right.
That's really hard.
Yeah, because you don't want to disrupt the meeting, you just want to disrupt the bias, right?
Yeah, but it is hard to say it. It's hard to say that. I mean, when that has happened to me, when like you weren't sure at first what you had done wrong, but I feel doubly ashamed. I feel ashamed because I've hurt someone else, and I feel ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. And in that moment, in that moment of shame, like I can tell you where I feel it in my body. It's like a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same physical sensation that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. Yeah, you feel it in your gut. Yeah, we all, but recognizing where you feel that shame will help you move through the shame. You can't blame your feelings of shame on the other person who pointed this out. We need to own it and sort of disengage the lizard brain and re-engage our executive function. And sometimes this sort of shared norm for how to respond can help. Thank you for pointing it out.
Yeah, and I guess when you say that you'll circle back, you have to be committed to do that as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the third thing is you've got to have a shared commitment. So shared vocabulary, shared norm, shared commitment to actually doing it.
Yeah, it could be really awkward at the beginning where you're all excited, like, hey, let's do this new thing that I heard about at South by. This is a way that we can work through some of this bias, but then you actually have to do it every single time, or else things will just feel like, we didn't do it this one time because it's awkward, and then everyone forgets to do it eventually, and then it doesn't happen.
So I hope this has been helpful for folks, and I hope you all have a bunch of questions for us.
So make sure you put in the Slido app, and if you have the South by Southwest Go, we're going to get to questions in just a minute. But if you kind of enjoyed this type of banter and conversation, this is what we do on our podcast. So if you're interested in subscribing, go to radicalrespectbook.com/podcast to get the podcast. If you are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you can just do a search for Radical Respect book or Radical Respect podcast as well. And you have a special surprise about the book Radical Respect.
You got some advanced reader copies, so you can get an early copy. At 3 o'clock, I'll be signing them.
Yeah, so if you go to the bookstore, you'll get an early version of the copies. You will not be able to get these anywhere now, but you can pre-order the final version of this copy right now, today. So go grab one in the bookstore, and also, if you enjoy this panel, make sure that you have all your friends sign up to get one of the pre-release, the copy now for pre-sale. So when it is released, you can get it. And if you know authors, you know that pre-release is extremely important. So make sure that you go ahead and get that in. And let's get some questions.
Let's get some
questions.
All right,
let's put up some Slido. You want to read the first one?
Yeah, I'll read the first one. So how do you handle being put down based on title, hierarchy, age at work? How do you fight against it if it comes from senior leadership? This is such an important question because, as I said earlier, when you layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying, it often turns into discrimination. Somebody doesn't give you an opportunity that they should be giving you, or it can be harassment. It can wind up in sort of a hostile work environment.
Yeah, the relationship you've built with this leader, it matters too, because if they know you, then maybe it was not meant to be putting you down. But if you have that good rapport. If you don't, then that's just a really bad situation.
So I think there are several things that I recommend doing when it's coming from your boss. The first is documenting what's happening. Even if you have no intention of taking legal action, But if you write it down and send it to a friend, send it to someone you trust. Don't write it down on your work computer. Don't write it down on your work email. Like, do it on your personal computer, in your personal email. And keep track of what's happening. And part of the reason to document what's going on is because it can help you fight the gaslighting. It's so easy to feel like something's wrong with you, when in fact something is wrong with this other person or with the system that you're in. So document what's happening. Do you have thoughts on documentation?
It's very important for yourself. And if you're able to actually bring up examples when someone says when this happens, and then you have a file, then you don't have to say, well, you actually can have like some grounding and some real data and fact.
Yeah, in fact, a journal can also help. Then you have the date and the description of what happened. It doesn't have to be like super long. It can just be bullets, date, place, this happened, this is the impact it had on me. The other thing you want to do is you want to build solidarity with others. This will also help you dispel gaslighting, and it will help you do the next thing that I'm going to recommend, which is locate the exit nearest you. If you not because you're necessarily going to leave, but if you, at least in my career, very often I felt more trapped and alone than I in fact was. And when I realized I could easily get another job, which is not always the case, but when I've been in moments when I could, then it made it much easier to do the other things that you can do, but you don't always want to do. Sometimes, if it seems safe, you can go talk directly to that boss. Sometimes the boss doesn't realize what they've done. And they will actually, there's a wonderful article called Protective Hesitation about the benefit of sharing this. Can be risky. You also want to consider reporting this to HR. Now, I want to acknowledge that HR is not always part of the solution. Sometimes they're part of the problem, but sometimes they're part of the solution. So you want to give them the opportunity to do the right thing. And if they do the wrong thing, document that. That will also be helpful.
Yes. We have a lot of questions, so
okay, let's keep going.
What are the first steps leaders that leaders can take to reorient and a team company culture towards one of radical respect? How does this differ from in-person to distributed? I guess that's, sometimes you're entered into a situation that you didn't cause it, but now you find yourself in there. And now you're a leader in this place. What do you do?
So I think that the most important thing you can do is to start with disrupting bias, and start by, not by asking everybody to do it for everybody, but asking people to disrupt your bias. Prove that you're open to that feedback when you might have done something inadvertently, hopefully, to begin to, that people feel comfortable telling you. I think it's also really important that you create those consequences for bullying. And then you want to be very cognizant of how you're designing your management systems. If you don't design management systems to be fair, you're gonna get systemic injustice every single time. So there's a lot more details in the book about how to design those systems.
Set an example, then set up a system.
And I think there's, the second part of the question, in-person to distributed, there's some very interesting evidence that was collected by Project Include, that people in a hybrid work environment often experience more bias, prejudice, and bullying than people in person. And yet, underrepresented employees feel more comfortable in the hybrid environment or in a remote work than they do. And so why is that? How do you, I think, I mean, I don't, I'm gonna offer a hypothesis, not data. But I think part of the reason, at least for me, is that even if I'm experiencing a little bit more bias, prejudice, and bullying in a remote situation, I can shut my computer and I'm in a place where I physically feel safe. And that makes it easier for me to deal with it. So I think it impacts me less. And then I think in terms of physical violations, those are not gonna happen. Nobody's gonna grab my butt over Zoom. So that's one of the great things about Zoom.
Also, if you're a person that's judged by the way you look, being able to turn off your webcam sometimes can give you that freedom of like a little bit of space and disconnect with that. So let's move on to the next question.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, please.
We don't always know the impact we are having on others, but how do we navigate the anxious generation that leads with negativity and low receptivity to feedback? You want me to take that?
I'll give it a go.
Okay.
Just it's hard to, when you feel that people don't want to take feedback, that sometimes it can feel aggressive. They feel like they either don't deserve it or that people are being nitpicky. What you need to do is, this is going back to setting up a system where you can have clear and transparent communications, and building that trust is some of the things that will give you the advantage of being able to have that experience. And then what you were saying before, setting up yourself to take in criticism allows you to be able to say, like, I can take it as well as give it, but please, we all are just trying to make each other better, but we're not making a referendum or if you're a good person or if you're a bad person. What we're trying to do is just make us all a little bit better, and there's always capacity to grow.
Absolutely. I think what you said about soliciting feedback before you give it is the most important thing.
Yeah.
I wrote Radical Candor in part as a result of my experience managing 700 recent college grads. And so there were a lot of what is, I think, unfairly called the anxious generation on that team. And here's what I believe to my core. It is the job of the younger generation to tell the older generation when we've messed up.
Yeah.
And we've messed a lot of things up. I'm speaking as a representative of the older generation here. And I found in that experience, when I was open to the feedback from my team, they were in turn very open to feedback from me. So in fact, they really wanted it. So I think it's kind of unfair to say that the younger generation can't take feedback as well as the older generation. I've found that they can.
It depends on the person and whether if you have a growth mindset or if you have a fixed mindset.
Yes.
We don't have a lot of time, but we'll try to get more in. But one last thing, if we don't get to your question, you can email us at hello@radicalrespectbook.com. Last question, do you have tips on how you can promote a culture of radical respect within a team where you are not in charge? So being an upstander would be great.
Yes, being an upstander, noticing what's going on for other people. One of the things that is really important about being an upstander is you may not feel that it is safe to challenge directly somebody's, especially if it comes from a leader, something that a leader said or did.
Yeah.
But you can check in with the person who you think was harmed afterwards. And this is really important. There was one time when I was on stage. It was like 5,000. It was a big company offsite. And the leader of that company, I was going on stage with two colleagues who were men, and he shook one guy's hand, he shook the next guy's hand, and then I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And he grabs it and kisses it, like licks it practically. It was like one of those disgusting. And that was bad enough. But what was worse is that nobody came up, none of those 5,000 people came up to me afterwards and said, that was weird. And so I felt sort of gaslit. Like, it is incredibly powerful just to check in with people when you notice something going wrong afterwards. Yeah,
the whole is it me or is it them question that bounces back and forth. So letting someone know, no, it was them is something that is extremely helpful. So thank you again. Thank you for coming to this panel.
Thank you
Once again,
so much.
3 o'clock, bookstore. Really appreciate you, and get your signed copy and pre-order Radical Respect today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.